Tonight, access denied, a border battle with a family's future hanging in the balance.
A national consumer revolt is exploding across Canada, and for the first time in modern North American history, millions of shoppers are actively turning their backs on the United States. What began as political irritation has erupted into a full-scale economic backlash, triggered by new tariffs from Washington, and intensified when President Donald Trump publicly referred to Canada as the 51st state of the United States. Overnight, a quiet neighbor transformed into a defiant market of 38 million citizens determined to push back through consumer power. Yet beneath the patriotic surge lies a far more dangerous reality. Canada relies heavily on American goods, American supply chains, and American agricultural imports to keep supermarket shelves full. A boycott of this scale does not simply disrupt retail aisles. It shakes the architecture of a $365 billion United States dollar trade relationship and exposes vulnerabilities that neither country has ever confronted. But here is the part no one is prepared for. The deeper analysts examine this boycott, the more a hidden economic shock comes into view. Stay with this report, because what emerges next changes the entire conversation. The first visible signs of strain inside Canada's retail network appeared far sooner than analysts expected. Retail executives reported that substitution costs for certain categories have risen by double digits, driven by longer transportation routes, limited seasonal availability, and higher import compliance expenses from distant markets. At the same time, Canadian producers are struggling to accelerate output fast enough to meet the sudden surge in domestic demand. The imbalance is creating localized shortages, unpredictable shelf rotations, and price volatility that affects millions of households. Economists describe these disruptions as early indicators of a far deeper vulnerability. The Canadian market is discovering how quickly a consumer shift can destabilize long-standing trade flows. The consequences are spreading beyond groceries. Logistics firms are reporting bottlenecks at distribution hubs as carriers adjust to entirely new routing patterns. Small retailers, unable to absorb mounting costs, warn that they may be forced to reduce product lines or close locations entirely. Even sectors unrelated to food are experiencing unusual turbulence, with importers of clothing, electronics, and home goods signaling that their risk exposure has increased sharply. The most concerning development, however, is the sudden pressure forming inside the internal Canadian supply chain itself. Provincial differences in regulation, transportation fees, and interregional taxes are creating barriers that the retail system was never designed to navigate at scale. These friction points, long tolerated because American imports were abundant and predictable, have now become major obstacles that threaten national pricing stability. What began as a consumer message is quickly transforming into a nationwide stress test of Canada's economic resilience. And as analysts examine new data emerging from distribution centers and import terminals, a pattern is forming that suggests the turbulence now visible to the public is only the surface of a much larger structural disturbance. The next development is far more destabilizing than a boycott, and its implications for both Canada and the United States will shock even seasoned economists. While Canadian retailers absorb the immediate shock of shifting consumer behavior, a quieter but far more consequential threat is emerging south of the border. The United States enters this phase of the trade war with an assumption that its economic scale will insulate it from Canadian retaliation. Yet early indicators now show that the most significant pressures may, in fact, be accumulating inside the American economy itself, particularly in sectors deeply dependent on Canadian demand. This is not a symbolic protest. It is a measurable contraction in revenue streams that certain American industries cannot easily replace. The American agricultural sector faces a direct financial hit. Canada is one of the largest foreign buyers of United States agricultural goods, purchasing more than 30 billion United States dollars of American food products annually. Even a modest decline in Canadian purchasing patterns can ripple through farming states that rely heavily on export activity. Early shipment data shows a noticeable drop in orders of apples, potatoes, lettuce, citrus, and packaged produce categories. For growers in Washington State, California, Michigan, and Idaho, This decline represents a tangible threat to seasonal revenue cycles. American farmers have already been strained by previous tariff confrontations with China. A second shock, originating from Canada, could amplify debt burdens, reduce crop investment, and accelerate farm consolidation. Agricultural economists warn that if the boycott continues and Canadians maintain preference for non-American suppliers, the United States may face multi-year consequences that reduce the competitiveness of its farming sector. Tourism-reliant regions in the United States lose one of their most dependable markets. American tourism operators widely regard Canadians as their most reliable and stable customer base. Millions of Canadians travel annually to Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and other warm weather destinations, supporting hotel chains, restaurants, theme parks, airlines, and rental car companies. A decline in Canadian traffic, even if small, can generate significant financial strain because these regions structure their seasonal planning around predictable Canadian inflows. Reports from industry groups suggest a contraction in Canadian bookings, with some sectors observing a decline of more than 100,000 travelers compared to previous years. This downturn not only reduces direct revenue, but also destabilizes employment in hospitality and service industries that rely heavily on winter season traffic. United States tourism executives are beginning to express concern that political decisions originating in Washington could unintentionally undermine local economies that have no role in federal trade policy. American manufacturers face sudden vulnerability inside the Canadian market. Canada is the largest export destination for United States manufactured goods, accounting for more than $300 billion United States dollars annually. The consumer boycott introduces a reputational and commercial challenge that goes beyond tariffs. Canadian shoppers are increasingly scrutinizing the origin of packaged goods, electronics, appliances, and household products. This shift threatens the market position of American firms competing in retail categories, where brand loyalty is fragile. Manufacturing states such as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania could experience the earliest disruptions. Reduce Canadian demand, even if incremental, can pressure factory output, shift labor scheduling, and complicate inventory planning. Executives warn that maintaining Canadian market share may become more costly as firms are forced to invest in marketing, relabeling, or deeper integration into Canadian production networks to appear less dependent on United States sourcing. Supply chain instability extends into American transportation and logistics systems. When Canada redirects procurement to Europe, South America, or Asia, the shift does not only affect Canadian ports, it reduces cross-border trucking, warehousing, and logistics activity that sustains thousands of jobs across northern United States. Cross-border freight volumes are a critical revenue stream for transportation hubs in Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, New York, and Washington state. A reduction in cargo flows deprives these corridors of customs revenue, fuel sales, truck service, income, and warehouse staffing hours. This disruption is particularly concerning because these regions have already faced structural economic challenges due to automation and manufacturing decline. The boycott introduces yet another layer of pressure to communities that are highly sensitive to shifts in trade activity. Political risk intensifies inside the United States. The trade war with Canada is beginning to generate domestic political pressure. Congressional representatives from agricultural, manufacturing, and tourism-dependent districts are unlikely to tolerate prolonged economic pain. They are already receiving early warnings from local industry groups that tariffs and retaliatory consumer actions are harming American workers far more quickly than anticipated. Political analysts caution that continued escalation could fracture internal support for federal trade policy. If enough sectors suffer measurable losses, Washington may be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The United States is not insulated from Canadian economic leverage, even when the pressure is indirect and consumer-driven. International competitors may capitalize on American missteps. As Canada shifts purchasing patterns away from the United States, exporters from Europe, Mexico, Chile, Japan, and South Korea are moving rapidly to secure long-term supply contracts. Once these contracts are established, they are difficult to unwind. The risk for the United States is long-term market displacement. Losing Canadian market share today could result in permanent decline tomorrow as Canadian retailers build stable relationships with non-American suppliers. This creates a strategic dilemma for Washington. The trade war may unintentionally accelerate global competitors' access to the Canadian market, weakening the relative influence of the United States inside North America. The deeper risk, a structural shift in Canadian consumer identity. Analysts are watching a more profound cultural trend. Canadians are not simply changing purchases. They are redefining what it means to consume responsibly. If this identity shift continues, the United States may face an enduring reduction in soft power and brand attraction within a market it has historically dominated. And yet, even this is not the most dangerous development unfolding beneath the surface. New economic data suggests that the real threat to the United States is not the boycott itself, but something far more destabilizing that is beginning to take shape inside North America's integrated supply chain, an emerging rupture whose consequences could exceed anything seen so far. As the trade war accelerates, analysts around the world are watching closely to determine whether the United States can maintain its long-standing economic authority across North America. What is unfolding between Canada and Washington is no longer viewed as an isolated bilateral disagreement. It is becoming a global case study in how consumer behavior, political rhetoric, and trade policy can combine to disrupt the balance of a regional economic system. International observers now see cracks in an architecture that has supported United States influence for more than 3 decades. Washington faces a shifting strategic landscape. Inside United States policy circles, the emerging tension with Canada presents a complicated dilemma. For decades, Washington relied on predictable Canadian demand to support agriculture, manufacturing, cross-border freight, and service industries. Yet the current confrontation threatens that stability. Economists caution that the United States risks eroding its most accessible export market at the very moment global competition is intensifying. Within the United States administration, advisors are divided. Some argue that maintaining high tariffs reinforces national leverage during trade negotiations. Others warn that the continued deterioration of Canadian sentiment could weaken United States bargaining power, especially if Canada accelerates diversification away from American suppliers. The debate is no longer simply about economics, it is about strategic influence. Allies evaluate the cost of alignment with Washington. Allied nations in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region are closely monitoring how Washington manages its dispute with Canada, a G7 partner long regarded as one of the United States' most dependable allies. When a government imposes tariffs on a longtime partner, questions emerge about the reliability of American commitments in other regions. European Union officials highlight the contrast between Canadian trade reliability and Washington's shifting approach to economic diplomacy. Japan's trade ministry publicly noted that Canada's diversification aligns with broader Indo-Pacific strategies to create resilient supply chains independent of any single country. These reactions suggest that the United States is facing reputational challenges beyond North America. International competitors find new openings. Countries including Mexico, Chile, South Korea, the Netherlands, and France have moved rapidly to take advantage of Canada's procurement realignment. As Canadian retailers reduce orders from the United States, alternative suppliers are negotiating multi-year agreements that could permanently reshape Canada's import mix. These shifts are especially visible in categories such as frozen produce, packaged foods, seasonal fruits, consumer electronics, and household goods. The long-term risk for the United States is not the immediate contraction of exports, but the loss of strategic positioning. Once Canadian supply chains recalibrate toward overseas partners, reversing that shift could require significant cost reductions or trade concessions that Washington may be unwilling to provide. Investors reevaluate North American stability. Capital markets are sensitive to signals of structural instability. Analysts note heightened uncertainty around sectors dependent on cross-border activity. Freight carriers, agricultural producers, and manufacturers with exposure to Canada are facing elevated risk assessments. If investor confidence weakens, the United States could see higher borrowing costs for infrastructure, transportation, logistics, and industrial projects. Ratings agencies have not issued formal warnings, but they consistently cite trade war volatility as a negative factor. The challenge for the United States is that many of these risks are self-imposed. A prolonged standoff with Canada could inadvertently reduce America's competitive edge at a time when emerging economies are aggressively expanding their export capabilities. The global supply chain begins to tilt. The trade war is also affecting multinational corporations that historically used the United States as the central hub for North American production. Companies are now reevaluating whether the American market remains the most efficient place to anchor their operations. Canada's access to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement makes it an attractive gateway for firms seeking tariff-free routes into multiple markets. If global producers begin shifting capacity to Canada to avoid United States tariffs, Washington could inadvertently accelerate a trend that reduces its role as the primary node of continental commerce. This possibility, once considered unlikely, is now openly discussed in international trade forums. Diplomatic consequences deepen the fracture. Diplomatically, the standoff has created significant friction. The Canadian public perception toward the United States government has deteriorated, while global partners express concern about Washington's unpredictable trade posture. The more this conflict escalates, the more Washington risks alienating nations that traditionally align with its economic leadership. Some international policy analysts warn that if the United States continues to apply tariffs broadly and without coordination, it may unintentionally encourage allies to strengthen independent trade blocs, thereby diminishing American influence, a looming strategic recalibration. Beneath these developments lies a deeper structural threat. The global trade ecosystem is recalibrating, and both competitors and allies are beginning to treat Washington as a less predictable partner. While the United States remains the world's largest economy, the erosion of trust in its trade reliability could shift geopolitical leverage in ways that are difficult to reverse. And yet, the most consequential shift has not been fully recognized. New intelligence from market analysts indicates that an emerging realignment inside North America is building momentum faster than any previous trade war scenario. The next phase does not merely challenge United States influence. It threatens to redraw economic power lines across the entire continent in a way few policymakers are prepared to confront. The deeper analysts examine the shifting relationship between the United States and Canada, the clearer it becomes that this confrontation is steering both nations toward long-term structural decisions that will shape the future of North American commerce. What began as a political dispute ignited by tariffs and escalating rhetoric has now evolved into a strategic crossroads where every move carries consequences that extend far beyond current market turbulence. For Canada, the sudden shock has accelerated conversations that economists have raised for years. The urgent need to reduce dependence on a single dominant trading partner. The boycott movement and the instability in supply chains have pushed Canadian policymakers to intensify efforts to diversify markets through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, opening access to more than 1 billion consumers across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Canadian industries are assessing how to redirect production toward these markets, viewing diversification not as a symbolic gesture, but as a structural safeguard against future policy volatility in Washington. At the same time, Canadian provinces are reconsidering internal economic barriers that have historically limited interregional trade. If Canada succeeds in reducing transportation fees, harmonizing regulations, and modernizing distribution infrastructure, economists project a potential lift in national productivity exceeding 7% in the long term. These developments suggest that Canada's response to the trade war may catalyze internal reforms that strengthen domestic resilience while simultaneously repositioning the country within global supply chains. Yet diversification is not without risk. Canada must build new logistics networks, secure stable overseas suppliers, and avoid cost inflation that could undermine consumer support for long-term shifts away from the United States. For Washington, the long-term strategic picture is more complex. The United States has long relied on its size, economic gravity, and integrated supply chains to maintain an unrivaled advantage in North America. However, the trade war with Canada is revealing that influence is not solely derived from scale. It depends on trust, predictability, and mutual benefit. When these elements weaken, even the most powerful economy faces structural vulnerabilities. The current dispute has already exposed the risk that overuse of tariffs may incentivize partners to explore permanent alternatives. Should Canada redirect even a fraction of its market toward Europe or Asia, the United States could face a gradual erosion of export dominance in sectors that have historically relied on Canadian demand to maintain competitiveness. International competitors are well aware of this opening. Countries in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region are actively strengthening commercial ties with Canada, positioning themselves to displace American suppliers if the trade war continues. The possibility of long-term displacement raises uncomfortable questions. Can the United States maintain continental leadership if neighboring markets perceive it as unpredictable? More importantly, will American firms be able to reclaim lost market share once alternative supply chains solidify? Historically, once a country restructures procurement networks, the economic and logistical inertia makes reversal slow and costly. The political implications inside the United States are equally significant. If agricultural states, manufacturing regions, and tourism-reliant communities continue to feel mounting pressure, policymakers may face internal demands to reassess federal trade strategy. The challenge is whether Washington can recalibrate without undermining its global stance or appearing to concede ground in a conflict it initiated. Strategists warn that the longer the dispute continues, the narrower the policy options become, ultimately forcing the United States to choose between maintaining symbolic strength and protecting the economic interests of its own workers. Yet buried beneath these visible strategic dilemmas lies a more profound question: whether this moment represents a temporary disturbance or the beginning of a continental realignment that will permanently alter the balance of power in North America. Indicators from supply chain modeling, foreign investment flows, and consumer sentiment point to early signs of structural change. Canada is increasingly treating diversification as inevitable. The international community is positioning to benefit from the shift. And American industries are beginning to recognize that resilience cannot be taken for granted. But the most consequential development has not yet reached the public narrative. Analysts studying long-horizon economic data have identified a trend with the potential to transform the North American economy in ways that neither Ottawa nor Washington are fully prepared to address. The next phase of this confrontation carries implications far more sweeping than a boycott or a series of tariffs, and its emergence could redefine how power, production, and prosperity are distributed across the continent. Behind government statements, trade reports, and shifting consumer sentiment, a deeper transformation is taking shape, one that neither nation publicly acknowledges, but both quietly fear. The trade war and the widening rift between the United States and Canada have triggered a wave of long-term reassessment among corporations, investors, and global supply chain architects. For decades, North America functioned on an unspoken assumption that political tensions could rise and fall, but the continental economic engine would remain stable. That assumption is now evaporating, and the consequences extend well beyond retail disruptions or agricultural losses. Multinational corporations are beginning to reevaluate where they place critical production lines, distribution centers, and research operations. Historically, the United States was the automatic strategic choice due to market size, proximity to Canada and Mexico, and its role as the primary logistics hub of the Western Hemisphere. Now, companies are questioning whether that model still offers the lowest risk. Canada's expanding network of trade agreements, combined with the unpredictability of American tariffs, is shifting the calculus. Executives increasingly consider whether basing operations within Canada offers smoother access to Europe and the Indo-Pacific, bypassing uncertainty generated in Washington. This shift remains subtle but visible in investment data, with several firms signaling interest in dual headquartered strategies that reduce exposure to sudden American policy swings. The effect is not limited to private industry. Financial institutions are quietly adjusting risk models that guide long-term lending to logistics firms, agricultural processors, and manufacturing networks tied to cross-border activity. If confidence in the stability of United States-Canada economic integration weakens, borrowing costs for critical American industries could rise, squeezing margins in sectors already operating under pressure. What makes this especially concerning is that these adjustments often happen before the public sees the symptoms, meaning the economic realignment could be further advanced than official statistics currently show. For Canada, the opportunity is double-edged. The country is becoming more attractive to global investors seeking predictable access to multiple markets, yet this attractiveness increases expectations that Canada will modernize infrastructure, streamline regulations, and expand domestic production. Failure to keep pace would weaken any strategic advantage gained from the present trade war. Success, however, could shift long-term economic gravity northward in a way not seen since the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement decades ago. Meanwhile, Washington faces a dilemma it has not encountered in generations. If the United States continues to lean on tariffs as a recurring policy tool, the global perception of American economic stability could erode further. Yet reversing course risks appearing politically weakened. The longer the conflict continues, the higher the stakes become for both nations, because the question is no longer who wins the next quarter of trade statistics. It is who commands the architecture of North America for the next 20 years. The emerging twist is that the boycott movement may be only the initial shock, not the final one. Beneath the surface, a structural recalibration is forming, driven by global investors, supply chain strategists, and national policy shifts that could reshape the continental economy regardless of political rhetoric. And according to analysts reviewing newly released forward projections, an even larger disruption is approaching, one that neither country is publicly preparing for and whose impact may redefine the North American landscape in ways few leaders have dared to imagine. The developments unfolding across North America reveal far more than a moment of political disagreement or a shift in consumer sentiment. They signal a continental recalibration that is testing the stability of long-standing economic assumptions. Canada is pursuing diversification at a pace few expected, and global competitors are stepping forward to fill openings once dominated by the United States. At the same time, industries inside the United States are beginning to feel pressure that challenges the belief that America is insulated from the consequences of its own policies. The trade war has become more than a dispute over tariffs. It has become a measure of how influence, trust, and economic power are negotiated in a changing world. As new data emerges and strategic choices narrow, Washington must decide whether its current approach strengthens long-term leadership or accelerates an unintended shift in continental dynamics. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States? The answer will shape more than trade flows. It will define the balance of prosperity across North America for years to come.